children are confused and it's better to just stick to one language. And I read this a lot in the comments and the posts that you mentioned before, starting from, well, if you decide to move to the country, then you have to learn that language. Ending up with, if you don't want to learn our language, go home, to that point. And what's in between is, well, children will be confused with many languages. And if you decided to settle down in a certain country, then it's advisable to perhaps even drop your home language and switch to the local language.
Welcome to the Family Dialogues podcast. What if raising a bilingual child is not about getting the right language mix, but about building a home where identity, belonging, and connection can grow in more than one language? Today, we're exploring how families can nurture bilingualism with confidence without fear, guilt, or the myths that often confuse parents. Today's guest, Miss Yulia, is a German and English teacher with a master's in childhood education and a specialization in bilingual education. She has spent nearly 10 years supporting bilingual families and multilingual learners in international schools, helping parents create language-rich homes and make informed choices for their children. Miss Yulia, welcome to our podcast.
Hi, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me.
I got interested in your work because I was just scrolling on Instagram and I saw that you posted a story about a family you were helping, and I think they were Portuguese, but they were basically being told by the kindergarten administrators that their child would need to redo another year because their German skills were not that strong. And that hit home for me personally because when I first came to Germany with my eldest, we were in southern Germany and he was in a primary school and it was time for him to go to high school. And they basically told him because he did not have strong German skills that, they have the ranking of the schools, that he could not go to a gymnasium, which is more academic based because of his lack of German skills. And then as a parent, I knew my son's natural abilities outside of learning German. And what helped me was that before we came to Germany, we were living in Canada. He did the cognitive abilities test, a standardized test that all grade 3 children in Canada had to complete. And so I brought that test and I said, listen, look at his scores, spatial, mathematics, language scores, you name it. They are pretty high. He was in the high percentile for all of them. And I said, this is his natural ability. Once he learns German, he will do well. Obviously, in the beginning, it's going to be a bit of a challenge. And I had to advocate for him. And since then, I thought he was accepted in the gymnasium. But since then, I thought about so many parents who might not have had like a standardized test from another country to say, this is my child's natural ability. How many of their children were just redirected into a path that was just not fitting for them? So when I saw your story, it just brought back memories of when I came to Germany and the challenge I had to be advocating. Luckily, I had other Germans, native Germans, who could help me to advocate. So it wasn't that bit of a challenge. To start the conversation, based on my experience, how common do you find it for bilingual parents when they're trying to navigate the education system and being told your child has to take a year or they can't go into the academic stream because they don't know German?
Mm-hmm. First of all, thank you for sharing your story. And just to reassure you that this is not the first one and not the last one, unfortunately. And I just want to clarify that this is not an exclusively German problem. Unfortunately, from what I hear, from what I read, and the also academic research that shows, unfortunately, it is the case in many countries. It is the term monolingual wall exists, and it's not only a German problem, it is unfortunately a problem around the world, I would say. And your story is one in a million, and I meet parents all the time that come to me in every stage of their child's development, kindergarten, starting school, or arriving later and then going and being placed in a stream instead of gymnasium in Realschule in case of Germany, in a different stream, just based on the language proficiency, right? Because unfortunately in many countries, or the educational system, I think worldwide, which is changing, and I think we will talk about it today, but they are very narrowed down to this monolingual child coming from, in case of Germany, from the German-speaking household, the child that had grown up or spent all their life in Germany, and the tests and standardized tests and the assessment criteria that are used to assess those children are used basically to assess everyone, and those who also come with other languages that are strong in the content but are lacking the language yet. And the systems are not always in place. The support system to help to integrate, to help support language development in this stream, which is academically the right stream for this child. There should be systems in place to support the language development instead of just placing the child in the lower, let's say in the lower stream, or in a different educational path just based on the language ability. It does have an impact on child's development, given that this child is cognitively at a different place and just has not enough language skills yet. And it's a huge difference between, I have the content, I have the understanding of big concepts, but I don't have words yet to explain them, or I don't have this understanding of big concepts. And it's a big difference. And it certainly has an impact on the child later on.
I can see the level of frustration the parents and especially the children would experience to say, hey, you are putting me in this little box because I am not yet able to speak the majority language of the country that I've migrated to. And unfortunately, if parents are also feeling insecure about their language abilities, or they do not yet have the support of others in the native community to say to them, hey, you can navigate this system. Because what saved me was that, yes, I think it was a Realschule they had placed my son. And I thought, oh my God, there's nothing I can do. And then my German colleague said to me, hey, the laws changed several years ago that yes, the primary school can recommend, but you choose where you want your child to go. The primary school principal did not mention that to me. Mm-hmm. So had I not have a native speaker to say to me, hey, yeah, it's a recommendation, but you don't have to accept it. You can go your own way. I can see how a lot of parents can just give up and say, okay, well, it's coming from a professional, so maybe they're right. Maybe I should go with what they recommend. When you have encountered a similar situation to mine, how do you support a parent to start advocating for their child in that regard? Because again, the frustration and thinking, well, I'm not an expert here. Maybe the recommendation is okay, but deep down inside, I kind of feel it's off. So for example, the family that you mentioned in one of your posts, that the child is obviously competent, it's just that they're not fully skilled in the majority language. How do you navigate a family going through that?
Yeah, I think the most powerful thing is knowledge. And that is not only happening to the expat families or the immigrants, it often happens to the German families as well. And it's not only about knowing or not knowing the law or rules, it's also about knowing, or this understanding of, there is an educator or a teacher or a school principal who's telling me this, and I as a parent want to do the best for my child, and this is why I have to follow the advice of the professional, right? It's like going to the doctor, and if we hear take ibuprofen 5 times a day, then I'll probably follow it without questioning. Now we have resources and we have the we can search on the internet and question certain things, but not everybody can do that. And also, you never know what is it that you're finding. Is it a good advice or a bad advice on the internet? So you probably will trust a professional, right? And so in this case, I think what I recommend is just starting from the beginning and saying, okay, what's the family situation? What is the child's growth? Where have we been? When did the family arrive in Germany? And just creating a family language plan, just for me to get an idea. What is it? Where is the family coming from academically, right? And also, where do we want to go? Where do we want to arrive? And from there, I'm usually starting to talking about myths and facts. And this is the most interesting part of the conversation with families, because they are, first of all, they're coming with their own beliefs and opinions as parents, depending on the background where they grew up, depending on their own beliefs and an opinion. And second, they're coming as with a strong conviction about this is what I've been told by the teacher. Right. And my job is to show them research, to give them examples, to explain how brain works, because not everybody has to know it. But I think as parent of multilingual child, bilingual parent, we have a certain obligation to be up to date with the latest research, perhaps doing some reading, to be a good parent, to be informed, to advocate, as you say, for your child. And it's not only as I said, it's not only for expat families, it is also for German families living in Germany who should be able to advocate for their children, right, who are learning additional languages. Because that idea of having a completely blank monolingual individual, a monolingual child is already the past, I would say. The majority of the world population is mainly bilingual, at least, or is learning additional languages in their later years. Yeah, so coming back to your question, looking about myths and opinions, and then looking at the facts. So what is it? How does our brain work? How does language acquisition work? And then with that, perhaps getting additional tests from outside in their mother tongue, and then going with that information to the professionals. And again, I don't want to blame the professionals. It has to do with the lack of the training. There is very little training, and especially in Ausbildung for educators in Germany, also for teachers worldwide, very little training when it comes to multilingual development. And it's changing. It's starting to change, which is a great news, I think, for everybody, for parents, for families, for teachers as well. But it's just understanding the root of the problem. So some people don't do that because they're bad people or they want to give bad advice, but because this is the way they were trained, because the research is developing and we're getting new facts and we're getting new information, and people not always stay up to date.
So what I'm hearing you say, you just gave a tip. So if families are migrating for whatever reason, if it is possible to get a standardized test in your native language to bring with you when you're migrating, so that you can better advocate for your child to say, well, I inadvertently had one. I didn't prepare with the intention. It's just that he did it. And so when I was advocating for him, I thought, but wait, he did a cognitive test. He did a standardized cognitive test. And so I brought that up. Obviously, they had to validate it that it's actually a genuine test from Canada. But just listening, if parents can, it might be a little bit costly depending on the country you're in. But if you can get a recognized, standardized test for your child in their native language before you migrate to whichever country you're going in the world that doesn't speak your native language, it will then better help you to negotiate and advocate for your child in a stronger position compared to saying, yes, I know my child. Every parent, they would say, oh yeah, every parent said their child is brilliant and whatever. But if you have that standardized test that is recognized, you're in a better position to advocate for your child. You mentioned about the myths. Can we go into that? What are some of the myths that parents are believing about having a bilingual or multilingual child?
most common, and this is what also many educators advocate for, is that children are confused and it's better to just stick to one language. And that when the family moved or made this decision, and I read this a lot in the comments and the posts that you mentioned before, starting from, well, if you decide to move to the country, then you have to learn that language, ending up with, if you don't want to learn our language, go home, to that point. And what's in between is, well, children will be confused with many languages, and if you decided to settle down in a certain country, then it's advisable to perhaps even drop your home language and switch to the local language if it's possible. And if it's not possible, then if the parents don't speak German, for example, then find as many opportunities as possible for the child to learn German or the local language in any other country. And I always go into the facts that are based on the research with the parents, exploring and giving them the tools to then advocate to say, no, brains are actually not confused and they're adaptable. And one of I think the most beautiful facts that I'm bringing up and that surprises parents a lot is that the third trimester of the pregnancy, mothers are often recommended to sing and to read stories, perhaps, and to speak to their baby that's growing inside them. Why is it recommended? Because the child already, or the brain already at that point, starts to recognize the rhythm and the intonation and melody. And there are certain studies that show that the brain reaction or brain response, and neurolinguistics focuses on that a lot, that the brain shows the better response to the mother tongue, to the tongue of the mother, than to any other language that was not present in the pregnancy. So that's the start. This is where we start. And when we start talking about how amazing the brains are capable of doing it already, being still in the mother's womb, basically, not before birth. And then when the child is born and the brain starts to create a certain sounds inventory, vocabulary inventory for each of the languages, and which proves that the brains are absolutely adaptable and able to distinguish between language 1, language 2. Of course, they're all active at the same time. It's not that we have 2 separate or 3 separate boxes. They're all interconnected, but the ability of code switching, of translanguaging, of choosing a right language when I need it, this is what brains can do. And it is absolutely wrong to recommend to drop speaking your home language or not learning additional languages on the basis of the confusion, because that's a total myth.
Yeah, it is a total myth because again, as you were speaking, I was going down my memory bank too, because obviously with us, we didn't know German at the time. And so my son was obviously just speaking to me in English. Similar to what you mentioned, he got involved in local clubs. I got tutoring for him. And within 9 months, how he described it, he said he woke up one day and it's like a switch went on. And then miraculously, he could understand everything. And it took him 9 months. Obviously, those 9 months, he was frustrated. He was in an integrated class so that they were using his native language, English, to explain to him certain things, but everything else was in German. But within 9 months, he was able to understand and speak fluently to the point that people thought he was born in Germany because he didn't have an accent. So if parents can really try to integrate their children more in the local community through sports clubs, or if they can afford it, do tutoring as well to help them. But we never stopped our our native language. So you're correct in saying, yeah, you don't put your native language in a box. And I now have 2 younger children, and my husband is German. And so he only speaks to them in German and I only speak to them in English. And as you say, they code switch. It's just effortlessly that they will just know without even thinking to speak to him in only German and to speak to me in only English. And they're able to do it well. So for parents listening, as you recommend, there is no need to put away or get rid of your native language. Your child is being held back in the majority language because they don't know it yet. Try to find as much support, play groups, clubs, sports, you name it, to get them to learn. And children learn pretty quickly, unlike us. So I think that's important. So how do children usually acquire more than one language in a healthy way? Maybe I have probably answered that in what I just said, but from your experience, how do they learn multiple languages in a natural way?
Mm-hmm. Before I answer your question, I just want to comment on what you said about putting your child in clubs and activities and providing support, which is absolutely true for the beginning, especially when the child arrives at the later period of their development, let's say before entering gymnasium, not the kindergarten level. It is certainly helpful, but then there will be a point, and I don't know how is it in your family, but this is what I hear from many. After a year, I'm noticing my child speaks more German than my home language.
Yeah, I had that. My son was actually forgetting English because I was the only one speaking to him in English. And how I come back to that was that every Sunday he had to write a journal about, he can write anything, his experience, anything he wanted. He had to write it in English and he had to read to me for 30 minutes in English. That's how I tried to maintain it, that yeah, he's doing all his schoolwork, all his friends, everything is in German. But for me, we did the daily normal interactions and I also got English workbooks. So he continued learning English formally from the workbooks. He had to write every week in English and then he had to read. So in the reading, I would then hear him stumble upon a word because he forgot what it is. And sometimes I had to explain the meaning of the word and so on. But to keep that balance, I did that. Maybe it worked for us. I don't know if it will work for other parents. Maybe that's something to do as well. Yeah. If you can bring your books from your native language or order them on Amazon. Now Amazon seem to be able to connect everything, but do that and have them read to you in your native language a lot. And the reading is maintaining the understanding of the sentence structure and all of that. It's not just calling out words, and for them to have deeper understanding of the language too.
Yeah. What you're mentioning are actually very good routines, and I speak a lot about routines with the parents at the last stage when we have already the language plan, when we know where we're going, when we know where we came from, then we speak about routines. And one of the routines that you mentioned, and again, it already answers your question, right? How to raise a multilingual child. Stick to routines, language routines, and it can be a book, it can be a visit to a museum once a week or once a month, contact to the academic language, your home language, because as you're saying, like for your children and for many children that are growing up here in Germany, the strongest language will be German. If they are in the local school, if they're socializing, so all their world is going to be in German, and English in your case or any other home language will be potentially at risk, and it will be a language that will be at risk of disappearance. And the job of the parents is to maintain and to make sure that this language also stays at the level that is desired, right? Because we often end up having adults or young adults, teenagers that would speak like 5-year-old because all the contact with the language they had was a small talk with their parents. And the academic input, the social input in the language they were getting in German from school, from the community, from after school activities. And then all they got in English or whatever language it was spoken at home was, how was your day? Go wash your hands, go shower, let's read a story. And so this is what you're saying, these routines that a family has to choose and stick to over years, and then also adapt, obviously, depending on the child's age and stage of development. They're super important because there will be a point when their bedtime story is not longer going to be a bedtime story. It will be the point when the child will have to choose their own book and read in the target language, in English, and they will most probably choose reading in German because that's the easiest way. Then if this contact, the literacy development was not in place in their home language, right? And as you say, workbooks, what do we do? Why do we introduce workbooks? Why do we do work in our home language? Because it is academic work, because it all leads to the literacy, and literacy skills are the foundation for the future language development. And that small talk, there will be a point when it won't replace or it won't be enough for the language development.
So yeah, continue to do your little informal thing. I mean, a language like English, sometimes children then get to choose as they go through the academic years to do that. But if your native language is not one of those 4 languages or so that are prominent in schools that children would learn, you then have to really take that proactive approach to teach, get the books, get the movies and so on in your native language. So in addition to the academic fluency of any language, why is the home language or the native language so important for a child's identity and emotional connection to their family and maybe to their native country?
Yeah, first of all, the home language is the foundation and the basis for acquiring any other languages. And that's just this linguistic awareness, this meta-linguistic awareness that the child gets in order to acquire additional languages. And probably, if I may again use the example of your child, is that the strong foundation there was in English, the quicker was the process of learning German. And perhaps it was overwhelming in the beginning, but it definitely helped this foundation that your child had in English. But with regards to identity, we always have to remember that language is not just a collection of words and rules and grammatical structure. It's more than that. It is stories, it is connection, it is certain cultural code that is transmitted through that language. And when parents ask me, for example, what books to choose to read to their children, I always say try to bring books from your home country. And it doesn't mean that it has to be bought in the home country. It just means that it has to be written originally in that country. Of course, there are certain tales that are absolutely universal that you can the runaway pancake. There is a Russian version of this, there is a German version of this, and it's basically the same concept of a piece of bread running away from the animals. And in different cultures, in different stories, there is this different type of bread or pancake that is running away or running through the forest, right? But there are those universal stories. But there are certain stories that are only written in the Hispanic world, where you see certain words, where you see certain rituals that are transmitted through that story and through that language, which is then translated into English or into German, perhaps would lose this value or what was meant to be transmitted, right? And that's an example of the fact that language is more than just words. It's connection. It's part of identity. It gives children certainty. They can with absolute certainty respond to where they come from, where their parents are from, what is it, the country or the culture they're connected to. And that definitely gives this foundation for confidence in general and just the sense of, I know who I am, right?
Yes, that's so important in a world that's always changing. It's really good to remember this is my foundation with my parents and this is my identity. And I do agree with you the two, because I've had that experience where you read the stories from your native country and it's just an understanding when it's translated to German or, maybe standard English. So if you're reading something from your dialect, there's really something lost to it that you can't really regain, no matter how sophisticated the translation is. So I have to agree that that is something, and it's once you know who you are from your native country, or you might have one parent from the majority country, parent from the minority country, you now have two identities to juggle with. And if you maintain that language through stories and so on and history, you then as a child can appreciate both sides of your family. Yeah, the majority country, I am in it and I'm getting all the exposure, but I am still from this other country too. And I can appreciate that other side to me, and I can value that other side to me. So parents, don't try to stifle the minority country culture and language and so on, because then you rob your child of an appreciation of the other side of them.
It is very important to have these conversations with children as well. No matter how old they are, just constant conversations about why we're doing it. Those whys, right? Why do I stick to my home language? Why is it that I want you to learn about my country? And perhaps it is easier. Not perhaps, it is definitely, I think we can say with certainty that it is easier to speak about the necessity of learning English, given that this is one of the languages that has this linguistic prestige, and it's one of the languages, right? German and perhaps Spanish is the same, and that's the reason why we're always given to choose those languages in schools when to learn as additional languages, schools, universities. But it is definitely harder, and it is a challenge to explain to your child, why do I have to learn Urdu, or why do I have to learn Hindi? Why is it important that I read in Hindi, that I speak and stay connected to that language? And it is those conversations about the language and about the necessity of being connected, staying connected to your roots is very important, and it is challenging, and I want to acknowledge that for the minority languages and languages that have less prestige in the world historically. But in order to do that, in order to have these conversations with the children, parents have to understand it themselves, because it is very common that the parents have this perceived unusefulness, that my language is not useful for my children. If parents have it, they cannot transmit a different idea to their children. So in my work, it is often starting with the parents understanding, having this understanding, and then passing it on to the children. Because that understanding why we're doing it for children is also very important. It's not just a random thing that my parent wants me to do, which creates lots of bad feelings, but it is a conversation that's happening between parent and a child, where child understands with time, of course, when they arrive at a certain stage of their development, when they understand that this is actually super important for me, and not just because of future job opportunities, but because of what we were just saying, the identity, connection to the roots, being able to speak, to have profound conversation with my grandparents or other relatives that are stayed in the country of my region. Right. And this connection is very important to the
Yeah.
children.
So it's, yes, parents is to think, not to think your dialect, your language and so on is less than the majority language that you're now living among, but to really look and say, this is part of nurturing my child's identity. And also having the connection, as you say, not every family member would migrate. So the grandparents, the great grandparents, the cousins, aunts, all of that, to still have that kind of connection with your family in your home country. I want to switch to the education system a little bit more specifically. So for bilingual and multilingual families, what should they look out for when they're trying to assess a school, when they want their child to maintain their bilingual identity? What should they look out for when they're looking for schools?
When parents are looking for schools, they're very often, or their choices are very often limited to the schools that are close by, right? And this is very practical, but then we just need to be aware of that this has an impact on the whole educational path of my child. And when we spoke last week to a family with a 4-year-old, And they told me, why do we talk about school? We don't start it in the next 2 years. And we cannot talk about what's the educational path of my child is going to look like in 10 years. And I often say, no, we do have to talk about it, because the literacy skills that we mentioned before are starting to develop as of basically age 5, even earlier. And then in school, when child turns 6, 7, right? And then it's just, that's the start, and you're laying the foundation of what your child will, or where your child will be when they are in grade 10, 12. So yeah, looking for the right school, it is important from the very beginning. And what is very important is to inquire about the language policy of the school. And each school has a certain handbook or language policy. They can call it as they want, but it is a framework how the school functions. And of course, then every teacher, independently on the policy, will take it to the level what is possible for them, right? Depending on the resources, depending on the knowledge the teacher brings, their own opinions and judgments. Of course, we're all bringing this to our lessons, but the school policy is already a foundation where it is stated that we value bilingualism, or we value multilingualism, for example. And if that's stated, then the school will very probably do the best to educate their teachers, to educate their pedagogues that work for this school, to provide the opportunities for professional development, to try to work with to maintain this relationship, good relationship, build the relationship between home and school in order to support child's language development. And that's the first question that I would ask. How is multilingualism viewed, or is it anywhere stated in the school policy, in the framework, anything about language? And it doesn't matter if it's an international school or bilingual school, because many parents think that bilingual or international or Europaschule, that the Europe school in Germany, is automatically gonna support a home language development. It is unfortunately not true. International schools also have their policies, and it is very important to look into those policies. What is it that they defend?
That's a good advice, to really check if you're going to get any kind of support from the school that you're interested in. To go a little bit more micro, then how can parents communicate with the teachers when their child is learning more than one language? Let's just say you might have a resistant teacher who is insisting, speak German, speak Italian. You're in the country, right? If a parent, unfortunately, has to interact with a teacher who is like that from the majority culture, how can then they speak to the teacher to consider having a more broader idea about language development?
First of all, being confident about your decisions and about what is it that you want to transmit to the teacher, right? This is what we started the conversation with. If you have the knowledge, if you have the facts, if you're bringing certain tests, as to say, standardized tests from your home country, or you had a conversation with a language specialist, you bringing anything on the table and having an open conversation. What is it that is important to you as a parent? That your home language is important, that you will continue speaking your home language, and this is what I'm basing my decisions on, right? My decisions are not just, I know what's right for my child, but my decisions are based on somebody's work, on the science, on my conversations with other specialists. And I think if parents can advocate for certain decisions they make and explain why they're making the certain decisions that sound less of an opinion, and this is how I want because I'm a parent and I know my child best, but more moving towards I do that because it is scientifically proven. And I think if you go with this to teacher, of course you can always then get a response that, well, that's your opinion. I'll just continue be the teacher I always was. Of course there is this risk, but you already have more chances that this teacher will listen And as I said, there is a development in educational systems, especially with young professionals that travel, that educate themselves, that have studied in different countries, and people become more mobile, and that definitely contributes and helps to the change that's happening. It is slow and it needs time, and it's depending very much on, unfortunately, still on where are you located, because I can imagine being based in Berlin, in London, it is a different, in Madrid, it is a different story than being based somewhere in the village of the south of Germany, in Bavaria, for example. But again, bringing that to the table, you already have big chances to be heard by the teacher. And those conversations exist in the beginning, throughout the year. Then you meet the teacher at the end of the school year. There is those parent-teacher conferences. And that's the place when you have to always bring this up and communicate what is it that you need and what is it that your plan is, where you see yourself. Also stating German is super important and this is what we're doing in order for a German to be stronger and in order for my child to develop German language. But we're also doing this because it is important to us, and those are the reasons.
It's really looking at, I would think, approaching the teacher that we can work as a team. So the teacher don't think you're coming there to tell them what to do, but also part of your advocacy as your child's advocate is to get all the information, not just your personal feelings. Because from what I'm hearing you say, a teacher might be more receptive if you say, I've consulted, I've gotten advice from a language consultant. I found these studies and so on. And how can we work as a team to maintain my native language and also to nurture the majority language? So it's not just going in like a bull in a china shop to say, hey, I want my child to maintain this, but it's to say, how can we do it as a team? And these are some resources that I've found. Would you consider looking at them or considering them? That kind of thing to kind of get them on your side. And I think that definitely would help a lot of parents who are just trying to navigate the system and feeling overwhelmed. What do you say to busy parents who wants to create a language-rich environment without making the language seem forced? Because it's easy when a parent, you might have one parent staying at home or one parent working part-time, but you do have a common scenario where both parents are working 8, 9 hours a day, and they still want to maintain majority cultural language, minority cultural language, but they don't want it to seem like the minority culture to seem so forced because they just have limited time. How can they create a language-rich environment when they're just so strapped for time?
I would say every family, this is the reason why every family needs its own plan, right? Because all the routines that we were talking about, they might work for one family and might not work for the other family, just because there is lack of time, or maybe even there is no emotional connection. If I say go to the movies, watch movies in English, and then there is someone who hates movies and never goes to movies, then that routine probably won't work for you. But there are ways, even for busy parents, to create routines at home. We all have joint breakfasts from time to time together, or dinners, or conversations with grandparents, or play dates with expats that speak the minority language, for example, and just looking at those routines that are already, or those events that are already happening in your life, apart from 8, 9 hours work, and seeing where can we add language to this routine. And there was that family that absolutely loved the routine that was connected to the Sunday's brunch. That was the only time when the family met together, because dad was working late, and so they never shared dinner together. So Sunday brunch was the only time when the whole family was at home. And they called it, because both of the parents spoke different languages, and English was their shared language between the parents. So that was the third language of the family. And they said, how can we introduce English to our lives? Because it's dad speaks Spanish, mom speaks Dutch, and they both communicate in English, and then German comes from outside, right? But because we never meet all together, we cannot transmit English to our children because dad wants to stick to Spanish, mom wants to stick to Dutch. And I said, well, since you have this brunch time on Sundays, why can't it be your English time? And it's beautiful and it's not confusing because it is always that Sunday. And I think they called it Sunday morning cafe, English cafe. So that was the time when, for children, that's the time and space when parents communicate in English, when I can also respond and communicate in English. And that was the only time when they could kind of have these shared conversations. And then parents were bringing to that Sunday morning cafe different topics or discussing their work, anything academic that goes beyond, or can you please pass me on the salt or whatever is on the table. So even for busy parents, there is this one or probably multiple times in the week where the routines of a normal breakfast or a normal play date or a conversation with a grandma can turn into a language input, a meaningful language input.
Find that routine that works well for everyone. So as we're wrapping up the conversation, what do you wish more parents understood about bilingualism and long-term success that we probably haven't mentioned yet?
What would I want them to understand? I think that the most important thing is to stay up to date and having the knowledge about how brain works. And I think when we have that knowledge, even if I'm not a teacher, not a researcher, having that knowledge will help me already a lot in communications with the educational, with schools, with kindergartens, in communication with local community when people come and give you a different sort of advice and opinions how to educate your children. It will help a lot in my own certainty that I'm certain of what I'm doing, and this is based on science and not on somebody else's advice, which I don't know might be true or not.
So to be proactive in
Being
knowledge base of the latest research on the brain and language development.
Yes. And as I said, it doesn't have to be, perhaps not everybody has perhaps the interest or time to engage with all of this, what's out there research wise, but perhaps having a conversation from time to time with a language specialist, or there are lots of podcasts that parents can listen to, videos that they can watch, because I think that's and I think I mentioned it in the beginning, that's an obligation of the parent that is raising multilingual child, and we have enormous impact on what this child's future is going to look like.
And so the final question for parents who feel behind or worried, what encouragement would you give them today?
My encouragement would be to just always remember how amazing bilingual brains are, what they can do, and what the advantages of bilingualism, multilingualism are. And just always remember that no matter what you do, the language that you pass, the stories that you pass on to your children will have an enormous impact on the child's spheres of child's development, creativity, decision making, future jobs, opportunity. So all your efforts that you're doing, they will pay off at some point.
That's beautiful. Just to recap what you said, it's just to be proactive. And if you're coming into majority culture, make sure you get your kids involved in local clubs, tutoring, anything in the environment that can help them to acquire the majority language quicker. Also important to check the school language policy just to make sure that they are willing to support your child. So I guess if you have an option to go outside of your local community for schooling that is more supportive of bilingualism, then that you might need to consider. Stay connected to your roots, gain support from others in the majority culture to help you to support your child in becoming competent in that culture language, but also to maintain your native language through routines. So, as you mentioned, maybe having breakfast and dinner together or just hanging out as a family to really enrich that language, encouraging conversations with grandparents and other members of the family in that native language to support them reading in the native language, writing in the native language as best as possible. So before we go, for parents who are interested in connecting with you because they're struggling maybe with a school system that is saying, hey, stop speaking to your child in your native language, what are your contacts? Where are you on social media? And you can give those handles so parents can reach out to you.
I have a website which is hellomultilinguals.com. And there you'll find all the information about the consultations that I offer for the families raising multilingual children. And also you will find there a parent guide. And that's perhaps to your question, what to do when I'm super busy. And this parent guide, which is called English for Young Learners, I wrote it again, not with the goal of a grammar book, having a grammar book for children to learn English, but having a place with all the resources and links where parents can go to and find the routines that work for them. And those routines are not only for English, but also for their home languages. And for all of those who want to maintain their home language, but also introduce English as a school language, for example. And that's the place to go. And you can find it all on my website.
And what about your social media? Are you on Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok, all of those? What are those?
My Instagram, where I'm very active, is called Hello Multilingual Classroom. I think, yeah, Classroom. I have a different one for TikTok. For TikTok, it's Hello Multilingual Class, where I also share advice and the question Q&A kind of videos, where I also address certain myths and facts in multilingual development, and where the example of the video that you shared in the beginning, sharing the stories from the families where you might see them and also feel connected to them and feel that you're not alone. So you can go ahead and check my work out there.
Thank you so much, Miss Yulia, and sharing with us. We live in a very interconnected world. People are constantly migrating, whether it's for job opportunities, to relocate with families, or because of, being in a war zone area that you have to migrate from. So it's really good to share with parents that it is possible to have a bilingual or multilingual child. And if they're struggling in, for example, the majority language, it doesn't mean that intellectually your child is behind. It doesn't mean that at all. It's just that they do have the intellectual ability. They just need some time to catch up with the majority language in the country that you're now residing in. Teachers who are not up to date with the latest research might think that, but it's to really advocate for your child. And as I mentioned earlier, if you can get a standardized test for your child in your native language before you leave, that would be a good source to advocate for your child in the majority culture where you're now living in. So thank you so much, Miss Yulia. And I hope parents will reach out to you who need that additional support.
Thank you for this conversation.
You're welcome. You're welcome.